Hi, and welcome to our Hurricane Preparedness Town Hall. The forecast is showing we have a potentially busy season ahead, so we have 3 local experts to advise us on how to prepare. We've got Chris Franklin, who is the Chief Meteorologist for WWL-TV. We've got Rubby Douglas, who is the Preparedness Section Chief for the Governor's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. And we've got Collin Arnold, who is the New Orleans Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness Chief. So to kick things off, we'll go to an ad from our sponsor, AARP.
AARP Louisiana is honored to sponsor today's town hall with the Advocate. I'm Alfred Mason, AARP Louisiana Volunteer State President. Like many of you across the state, I have experienced the devastation of losing a home to a natural disaster, such as a hurricane. This personal experience fuels my dedication and passion for raising awareness about disaster preparedness. AARP Louisiana stands alongside you, providing vital information and resources like today's town hall. Year after year, we remain steadfast in our role as your wise friend and fierce defender in emergency planning. This is the essence of what we do at AARP Louisiana, empowering and protecting our community. To learn more and to get involved, visit the website below.
So the forecasts so far this year have not been good. We always hope for the best but prepare for the worst. So maybe we'll start things off with Chris maybe explaining to us a few of the factors that are making the season potentially so difficult. I think it was one of NOAA's, if not the worst, May forecast that they've ever issued for hurricane season.
Correct, yes. Really, even before the forecast came out, everyone was looking at the likelihood that this was going to be a very active season, and the factors coming into play were the above normal sea surface temperatures across what we call the main development region. So that goes from kind of beyond the Caribbean across that central part of the Atlantic. That's kind of the hotbed of a lot of our storms, and those sea surface temperatures have been running high even going back into the late winter. So we were looking at that being the hotbed in the coming months. And so that was already setting the stage. Plus, we're looking at the development. We're not in it yet, but the likely development of a La Nina. What that does is it kind of suppresses the wind shear, which would help to rip storms apart across that same main development region. And so with those 2 factors coming into play, we're expecting a lot more activity. Now, what's also interesting is that in an El Nino, which is what we still are under and had last season, and actually was kind of a record-setting El Nino, we still had an active season. So just because the ingredients are there for it to either be slower or more active, sometimes nature doesn't really care what these factors are. It'll find somewhere else to develop them. But all the factors are definitely there for it to be an active season. And yeah, like you said, the forecast from NOAA was 17 to 25. They give a range, named storms with 8 to 13 of those becoming hurricanes, and then 4 to 7 being major. And not a surprise when their numbers came out after Colorado State, who had also forecasted an active season. Everything is pointing to it being busy. What I don't particularly like, and I say this all the time on air about these seasonal forecasts, is that it doesn't tell you anything about landfall or impact. It doesn't tell you anything about what we could see here along the northern Gulf Coast and what impacts we might see in any given season. And I also don't like it for the fact that if, say, we were talking about all these amazing factors to keep it a suppressed season and we're not expecting many at all, would that really change your plans for preparation? I wouldn't think so. I think you prepare exactly the same no matter what those seasonal forecasts are calling for.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, and I guess in some ways, a lot of those factors sound similar to what we had in 2020, 2021, right? When we had Laura, Delta, Ida. I think we were in La Nina during
right.
that
And
phase.
one thing I like that Colorado State does, they don't just issue the numbers and then leave it at that. They go through pages and pages of reasons why, and they do what's something called analog years, where they analyze similar seasons and then explain what those similarities are. And the years that they use were 1878, 1926, 1998, 2010 and 2020. 2020, we had 30 named storms. Now, 2010, we had 19, so it was an active season there. But what's also interesting is that those 3 years prior were all average or below average. So even in an analog, there is the possibility, now it's a lower possibility, but there's a possibility that we have an average season. And I know there are some folks, usually more the weather enthusiasts, non-meteorologists, that start saying, well, look, it's, June 12th and we haven't had a named storm yet, so what's going on? Well, the season always starts off slow. One thing that's always kind of difficult for us is that we have this big build up to the June 1st start, and then it usually is pretty quiet for a couple of months. We don't really get into the swing of things until August, and then the peak of the season being September 10th. So looking at past seasons, it's looking as that will be likely an active season. But even if as you look at those past seasons and the impacts that we saw in 2020, that does not necessarily mean you are going to have those type of storms. Each season is individual, each storm is individual.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anybody in the state will forget late August, early September as key times to remember. We've been hit so many times during that period.
There was a part of me over the last 2 years, after we got past August 29th, you kind of breathe that sigh of relief because of Katrina, Ida, and there have been others around the 29th that it's something about that date that we just wish we could erase from our calendars, and definitely had that. Okay, we got through August. Now, September 10th is still the peak, and you can still get pretty active storms into October. And then we had Zeta that wild year just before Halloween. So we can still get the activity late, but there is definitely something mental reassuring about getting past that, even September 1st, that it seems like the end is near.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Ruby, with all that in mind, maybe you can explain to us a little bit about how the state is preparing this year. What are you advising residents to do? Has much changed this year? And I guess, as Chris mentioned, to you, obviously you're watching the forecast, but maybe it doesn't change preparations because all it takes is one hurricane to really.
I love how Chris said, we're definitely gearing up for June 1st. But as at the state level, we look at preparedness being a year-round thing. And even we've noticed, even in the spring, we've had some very significant severe weather, tornadic behavior that we've never really seen that way before, and really causing catastrophic damage to a lot of rural communities. And so we are looking at, based on lessons learned that we've learned from Ida, we've learned from Laura, because we're actually starting this hurricane season with 46 of the 64 parishes in some state of recovery. And I think people forget the magnitude and the widespread catastrophic damage. When you're looking at that, we have to stay, and it needs to be more than just bottled water and tuna fish. I think everybody knows how to put their hurricane preparedness kits together, but really looking if the damage is that significant, how are they making their families comfortable? We know that the first thing goes out is power. And I'll be honest with you, we usually at the state level and local level talk about the first 72 on you. But we know that power grids can go down for at least 6 weeks to even 2 months. And so really thinking about what your family needs, going and heeding those warnings, because we've gotten really good about projections. So we're really kind of looking at that. If you can reduce your risk, get ahead before the storm, you're going to save yourself time, convenience of being comfortable, as well as if you get in that, we tell folks when people have a misunderstanding of what contraflow means, we say go before contraflow, because at least that way you won't be stuck in traffic. So really preparing from that perspective, and a financial preparedness, because if you cannot return home, you may have to relocate for a little while. And people don't like to hear that, but it's very, very true. When you go look at the past impacts that we've had in Hurricane Laura and Delta, as well as Ida, those communities are still recovering, and it's going to take a while for them to do that.
Yeah. Hey, Collin, similar question to you on the city level. I know you mentioned in the past how power is a concern. I know you all are trying to get some of the, I don't know if you call them cooling centers or that sort of thing set up. But what are you advising residents this year?
No, and I would harken back to what Chris said too. I'm not a fan of the big, hurricane season projections, because it's cliche, but it only takes one, and we've been impacted in below average seasons heavily, and we've saw last year fourth most active Atlantic hurricane season, and we weren't touched. So, I think that the key is to, and we have a community that's been impacted by hurricanes and by other disasters, and so I think that we're resilient. And I think that for the most part we're prepared, but I just want to make sure that people don't get complacent, and that at the same time when they see those big numbers of 25 storms and things like that, that they're not losing hope in the fact that stay weather aware, have a plan, stay connected with your media sources, your trusted media sources, your government, whether that be through something like NOLA Ready, or if you're in another parish, reach out to the local officials and just be connected and be ready to go if you have to. And then having a plan, whether it be, we've always talked about for lower level storms, the tropical storm to a Cat 3, you're probably safe sheltering in place. So having that ready to go. The higher level storms, the Cat 4s, the Cat 5s, obviously, I think evacuation, self-evacuation is preferred. It's always going to be on the table. It's always going to be something that you should look at, particularly if you have somebody that has, maybe elderly, has medical special needs, has, pre-existing mobility or medical conditions. It's something that, we're very concerned about. And so from our standpoint in the city, we've been looking at these storms over the past couple of years and seeing the rapid intensification, which is very difficult to predict. They're getting better at doing the track, but intensification is still a question. And so, there may be decisions that have to be made earlier than we would typically do in previous years. I think Rubby talking a little bit about contraflow. That's a decision that, takes a lot of time to set up. You're talking about 72 hours before the storm even arrives. You need in order to make that plan happen, it involves a lot of movement by law enforcement and infrastructure, transportation departments in 2 states. And so it is a challenge. And so I think what we have to prepare for and what we're working on at the city level is, like you said, what we've called cooling centers in the past. We were referring to them as emergency resource centers, or ERCs. We've got a lot of partnership with NOHSEP and our recreation department as far as having up to 14 facilities available that we can put power on in a very short period of time. They have transfer switches on them. We can set those up. It took us a little while the first time after Ida. I would say I think we've been able to cut that in half as far as being able to resource and have these things set up within, I'd like to say at the most 24 hours after the storm passes, which is well within that 3-day, 72-hour kind of period of we ask you to be self-sufficient. We know that that's not always realistic, and so our goal is to get them out there as soon as possible. But what you're going to get there is some water, of course, ice, food, these types of different things to get people through, at least initially. A little bit of light medical triage, nothing serious there. Obviously, we'll rely on our partners with EMS to come and help out in that situation. But the ability to get into some air conditioning for a few hours, the ability to charge your mobile devices and be able to be connected to Wi-Fi. We have purchased several Starlink units that we're able to put on these facilities, regardless of whether or not your cell service goes down. We'll have some ability to connect there. And then, of course, working with the fire department and EMS as well, the ability to transfer oxygen bottles for those that need them, or batteries for people that are on medical devices that require those. We'll also have a number of fire stations around the city where you'll be able to switch out those oxygen tanks and things as well. I know our focus is on particularly our most vulnerable in our community. And I'm looking at that as the elderly and those with pre-existing medical conditions that are most adversely affected by not only the storm itself, but by the aftermath of the storm. And I think our focus is really on the aftermath, because what we're seeing, and the data bears this out, is that the people that die in hurricanes die after the storm. They're not dying before the storm or in the middle of the event. They're dying from heat-related illness. They're dying from cardiac arrest. They're dying from electrocution. They're dying from carbon monoxide poisoning from the improper use of generators. And that's just kind of that's the facts. And so anything we can do as a city to try and protect our most vulnerable residents in particular from heat And I am concerned about power loss based on just the storms that we've seen over the past decade, and particularly over the last 3 years or 3 seasons. Anything we can do, that's what's on the table right now to try and do.
Yeah. And I guess one key point related to that, although you're putting these very useful centers in place, for people not to think of that as a full shelter. These are supposed to be temporary places.
No, and that's a great point. But, we are looking at some scenarios where we would have to possibly refuge people. And what I would say is I would not look at that as a plan. I would say still, if the storm is bad enough, evacuate. Do everything you can to evacuate. We'll do what we can to enact the city-assisted evacuation. But again, those are plans that take quite a bit of time to set up. We were not given that opportunity during Ida. The timeline just didn't work. And so we've been working to try and trim that timeline down of how long it would take to set up at least a hasty evacuation where, again, seniors, those with medical issues, mobility issues, those living in independent living facilities on the 9th floor of a building with no elevator and no power. How do we either get them out before the storm, if we can, or certainly after the storm? And we have some experience with that post Ida of moving some people into sheltering in central and North Louisiana with the assistance of our state partners. Obviously, huge lift there. And then the ability to bring them back, and we actually set up our own sheltering at rec centers, a week, 2 weeks down the road, just to get people to a place where they're either getting into that transitional housing and those opportunities that will come after the storm, but at least kind of addressing that gap of, I consider about a week to potentially 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, and you raise the important point of the vulnerable population. We have a lot of seniors in New Orleans, a lot of seniors across the state. Maybe if y'all could talk a little bit about advice for the senior population. How do you prepare? Especially if you might have medical needs, that sort of thing. What can you do maybe in advance of these storms, in advance even now, to get ready in case we do have to deal with one of these situations? Maybe if you start with that, Rubby.
Well, I'll just tell you, Collin does an excellent job. It's really about partnerships, because who's actually reaching and touching those vulnerable populations. I look for citizens. I mean, we work real heavily with Council on Aging and other health and even social service providers, because it's important for them to be able to provide, again, more than just an emergency kit checklist. But if you had to evacuate, and let's just say you have a network of service providers, you got to be able to evacuate where you can reconnect to those service providers, whether that might be in another city. So we're trying to build ambassadors, if you will, through those networks, because it's not just me and Collin. It takes a whole village to really support the community, especially vulnerable populations. I also look at, we talk about the forecast. It's important that individual responsibility begins at home. The state is never going to let, and the city is never going to let their citizens fail. But the other thing is there's got to be some kind of initiative there. I also talk about vulnerable populations for those with medical needs. Some of them actually, if you think about that, we've got a disabilities advocacy group at the state level and trying to make sure that they're prepared to execute those plans that they have. It's important for them to be able to be connected so they can be referred to those services. It helps their livelihood and helps them thrive if they do have to evacuate. And we can't forget the vulnerable when we look at folks that actually, oftentimes I think about other individuals that may have limitations. And that could be either from access and functional needs, or maybe they don't really understand the messaging. It could be that maybe English is not their first language. And so we need to make sure that we're building those stakeholders to provide ample information about hurricane preparedness, how to access those resources. Public housing, I consider them a vulnerable population, because usually when you look at a population of our state, 4.6 million people, half of those folks actually live below the Boudin line. You know what that Boudin line is, right? Below I-10. And so you think about the level of populations that you have to evacuate out of harm's way. These folks probably have waited all their lives to get into some kind of stable housing. They don't want to leave. And so it's important. These storms are not 72 on you. We look at critical infrastructure being significantly damaged. We try to really encourage people to go ahead and make those friendships, seek family refuge, so that way they can be comfortable. When it's safe to come back, they can.
Yeah. I'll just say first, Collin, you might get some debate on where the Boudin line begins and ends, but anyway.
I'm going to steer clear of that one, but with everything else, I totally agree. I think that it starts with the family members of these vulnerable folks, seniors and those with medical conditions. You have to make them part of your plan. You have to come and get them. You have to make sure that there's a seat in the car for them if you're leaving, or that there's some plan to address them, because otherwise you're leaving them in potentially a very bad situation. And again, I mentioned some of these independent living facilities. These are not nursing homes. Nursing homes have been regulated for 20 years. They've learned hard lessons. They have power generation on site. They have evacuation plans. They have evacuation locations that they go to. They have transportation and medical and food contracts in place. I'm not talking about in New Orleans 13 nursing homes. We deal with them every year. They're a partner in this. What we're talking about is these independent living facilities, the ordinance that was passed after Hurricane Ida. We've identified about 68 locations around the city that specifically rent to those that are elderly and many with medical conditions under government programs. And, look, in fairness to them, there is not an expectation of care, like there would be at a nursing home or assisted living facility. These are apartment buildings, but we want to know who they are and where they are, and we're getting that information from them now by ordinance. I just reviewed a bunch yesterday. It's getting better every year as far as their kind of expectation or our expectation on them and what their level of being able to be prepared is. They don't have to have an evacuation plan. They don't have to have really a plan, but what they do have to have is the ability to communicate with us on a daily basis while we're activated during a tropical type scenario, to let us know what the condition of their facility is. And then they need to provide us a continual active census of who's in the building. And so we have that information. But what I would say to your question is, call 311 if you're in New Orleans, register for the Smart 911 registry. If you are a senior, if you are somebody that has medical conditions or mobility issues, somebody who you think you cannot get out, we want to know who you are, where you are, and how to get a hold of you, because we've accepted that there will be situations where we may have to come and get you. It may not be before the storm. I'd like it to be, if we have the timeline to do it, just to be safe, but it will certainly be in the immediate aftermath of the storm, checking on you, making sure you're okay, getting you down from that 9th floor, getting you into a situation, at least temporarily, where you are going to have a better outcome. And so that's, I think, what we can do right now. Now, if I keep saying seniors, we got a lot of real able seniors out there too. So check on your neighbors, check on those that you may have concerns about, and then do the same type of planning that you would do, for any family, any individual, to make sure that you're going to have a good outcome.
Yeah, that's great advice, yeah. And so we touched a little bit on this fascinating but also frightening point of rapid intensification and how to get out, contraflow, all that sort of thing. Maybe, Chris, you mentioned a little bit, but can you explain a little more? What is rapid intensification? Why is that happening? Is it happening more now? What are we seeing?
There have been a number of studies, I was just looking at some of them last night, that are saying that we're likely seeing more of the rapid intensification. With tropical systems, hurricanes, they are heat engines. They rely on heat. So the greater the heat at the sea surface levels, below sea surface, where we're talking about oceanic heat, you'll hear all these terms throughout the season. So when we talk about sea surface temperatures, it's just the temperature of the sea surface waters. And then oceanic heat content is as you go deeper into the Gulf, Caribbean, Atlantic, how warm is that water? These storms start churning up the very shallow water. If it's only warm at the surface, it churns up colder water. It can kind of kill itself off, especially as storms kind of meander or just sit. So we look at those things, but also the atmospheric heat. With a changing climate, and I'm not getting into the whole climate change debate and all, it's definitely warmer. So there is more of the warm water, more of the warm, humid air. And so that's likely why we're seeing more of the rapid intensification. Most of the studies that you'll look at is that, or that you'll read, are we don't still completely understand why it is happening and why some storms will show this, show the signs of new thunderstorm development, new convection that we say forming, and then explode in strength, and then others don't. And as a matter of fact, one of the papers I was reading last night said that of all of those storms where you see kind of the new convection and thunderstorms starting to kind of refire up, 90% of them don't rapidly intensify, only 10% of them do. So it's not all storms. It seems to be the ones that are right near our coastline, and as you heard from everyone about timeline, that has been huge with these rapid intensifications, because without knowing the exact times, it usually is about 3 days prior to get any kind of major plans in place with the regards to contraflow or anything else. We don't really see that anymore. You're getting it now where, and even going back 100 years, most of these major landfalling U.S. storms are tropical storms, sometimes only 50 hours prior to landfall. So that timeline is shot. So this is something that we still struggle with, and you had mentioned before that or someone mentioned about the track forecast is pretty spot on. I will say you don't really see the track, the cone changing a great deal. Once those initial forecasts come out, you don't really see the dramatic shifts in the track any longer. You'll see some wobbles here and there, but those tracks are pretty locked on. 15 years ago, it was almost kind of a joke that when that first forecast came out, you wanted to be in the crosshairs because it was not going to be there 5 days later. That's where you wanted to be. And now, once that forecast comes out, 5 days, it's not going to move a whole lot. And there is a lot more that can be discussed about wobbles one way or the other and why we track the center of the line and all that. But what's still the more complicated part of the forecast is that strength. What is going on inside the storm? We may never have a complete understanding of the inner workings, dynamics in real time of these storms. Air Force, NASA, NOAA are trying their best to get more information with additional flights. We've got sail drones. The Navy is involved now. As a matter of fact, we'll have on some of the Hurricane Hunter flights Navy personnel dropping sail drones to get more sea surface data and what the pressure is doing, the winds are doing at the surface levels instead of just the entire column of the atmosphere. So we're trying to figure out in real time what's happening. And without getting into the complexities of computer models can only work so fast with the data available. So that strength forecast is always going to be a far more difficult feature. So usually what we have said on air, and I've said it numerous times, is when we're looking at the landfall potential of Ida is a great example. It was going to be a 2, and I said always imagine that it possibly could be a strength higher. Right. Just go with that. Just assume it's going to be, and ended up being 2 higher than that. As we got a little bit closer, we certainly had that forecast pretty locked on, but at that point, you're now less than 24 hours from landfall. You kind of have that general idea of what the impacts are, which communities are going to be impacted the worst. But as we even saw from Ida, just a little wobble one way or the other could have put New Orleans proper far more into the worst part of the storm than we were.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, and some of these technological improvements are really fascinating. But as you mentioned, I mean, we're getting so much better at it, but there's only so far you can go with this
right.
stuff.
And we may reach a peak or a point where the forecast just cannot get any better. Our computer capacity, the modeling data, the ability to get that real-time information will kind of plateau. And eventually we may hit a peak where this is as good as it will ever get. And I will say we're pretty good with the way those forecasts are right now.
Yeah, all right. And yeah, I mean, I guess, as Chris mentions, this really kind of complicates the equation of how do we prepare when a storm is coming? What do we plan for? How strong is the storm going to be? Collin, if you could maybe talk a little bit about it.
That is the challenge.
Yeah.
The challenge now is looking at something, and forgive the slang, but looking at a blob in the Gulf of Mexico that hasn't even developed, that and you're hearing And looking at the projections, this could be something very significant within 4 or 5 days. But until you actually get a plot and an actual, I wouldn't say a name, but a number, and it's listed as a depression, and it's something that they can actually lock onto and look at. It's our challenge is, can we make a decision about activating some huge plan?
I say this all the time.
Right.
Would the public even heed those warnings?
Right.
If
And that's a huge
there's nothing
challenge.
there's nothing in the Gulf. What are you talking? Well, our models are showing this could be a major hurricane in 3 days on Louisiana's doorstep, but it's not there now, so
Right.
I'm not going to do anything
Right.
yet. The models are always wrong. So I mean, I hate to interrupt, but it's just
No, and
I'm
it's
on a soapbox. with that.
100% because it brings in the contraflow discussion. I said it a few weeks ago during the mayor's kind of her opening hurricane season press conference. I was shocked and a little dismayed to hear from the public. Post Ida, we worked with the legislature, a couple legislators here, and they set up kind of a civilian kind of task force. Asked for opinions from the community about contraflow, and because it wasn't able to be used, and to hear people say like, "Well, I need you to do contraflow because that's when I decide to evacuate," and that's never what it was designed for. It was really designed as like, you need to move 1.3 million people out of the metro area, not even counting the 2 other areas towards the coast that have already started moving out, and you don't want to lock them in on the West Bank. You have limited amount of road space. Contraflow is the ability to just kind of like throw all the gates open at the last, just like, come on, everybody get out, because we know people delay. And so it is a last resort. But to Chris's point, how do you tell the public this may be something in 4 days?
Well, but
and then it may not,
Yeah,
but the chances are, in my opinion, and from what we've been seeing, it probably will be, and so you need to just be ready, be ready to have your simple things. Start building, your kit at home. Get a case of water a week. It lasts for years. Get some canned food. It lasts for years. I know these things are expensive to a lot of people, particularly in New Orleans, and we understand that financial constraint, but you don't have to do it all at one time. Build up your supplies as you go. Always keep a full tank of gas in your car during this time of year. I mean, it just makes sense, and just do what you can to try and get towards. We opened this with kind of how June 1st is a pretty arbitrary date, right? In my office, we look at 2 dates. We look at June 1st and August 1st. June 1st is yes, we're ready. We've done all our training. We've done all the things that we can do to kind of be ready for hurricane season. August 1st is the no BS. What are we lacking on? What do we need more of? Who's not on board? It's the real kind of let's go. It's go time. And so I would, as the public, use these 2 months that we may have. And look, we may have a tropical depression, we may have a rain event, we may have a tropical storm. But in these 2 months here, start refining that plan and really getting those supplies that you need and making sure that you're ready to go.
Yeah. Let me just mention real quick. I think we assume everybody knows what contraflow is, but maybe there's some new residents who don't know. This is when we turn the interstate lanes all in one direction so everybody can get out. It's only been used twice. It hasn't been used since 2008 during Gustav. And that's because it's incredibly complicated to put in place and can actually be worse if it's not done correctly in the right circumstances. So I think, as you all have been pointing out, don't rely on contraflow. It is a last-ditch effort that the state and the city uses when there's no other options. So you have to get out before that. So anyway, Ruby, if you want to address some of those
Well,
issues.
I agree with Collin on there because we look at it as preparedness because we talk about hurricanes, but we also know the great floods of 2016. That was just a depression. And so here's the thing: I don't watch the forecast just to know to bring my umbrella. I do know that there are certain areas that I can't drive in because they're low-lying areas. So I look at it from that perspective. I think Collin is right. Sometimes we put demands that you have to to have your kit ready there. But I think the people at Walmart think I'm always doing hurricane preparedness because I'm always ordering my case of water. But it's important to make sure that we have those together. I mean, I go for contraflow. We do contraflow in Baton Rouge for LSU games. And so that's really a practice mechanism to expedite people to get out of harm's way. But contraflow, as Collin said, is very complicated. It regards a lot of agreements between the Department of Transportation with 2 different other states. State police has to be heavily involved. But the other thing is those tropical storm winds. I mean, we can't have buses on the roads with 35 miles per hour winds. And so it's important for people. I think people know that we have a plan in the toolbox, but they can't rely on that. You know, when we go shopping or we go just driving down New Orleans, congestion and traffic can be quite challenging. And so think about that when everybody else is trying to go out the same way. So again, I say get your plan in order, find out if there's a family member or a friend that you can go with. And that's where they need to go ahead of time. That's important because we can't predict. We can't control Mother Nature. I know, Chris, you probably email her every now and then and say, okay, can you calm down a little bit? On occasion. But we can't control that, and we can't predict what impacts are going to be able to happen there. I look at people, if they want to have real comfort and for their family and themselves, to get out of harm's way before we have to exercise these other extreme measures.
Yeah. Maybe if you all could talk a little about kind of just real practical stuff, like at what point do you advise people to leave? I know we just discussed how rapid intensification is making that difficult, but sort of in general, at what point should people look to get out? What should they do about pets? Those sorts of things. How do you advise
Well,
people
the state
on that?
plan does have. We have partners with the Department of Agriculture and Forestry that actually help support our pet shelters. So even at our shelter plans, that we do have those available. Even at the local level, I know they partner with the pet associations, those different entities that support that. I guess from my perspective of doing that, I think about the hardcore Louisianian. And I think we have experienced 3 years of massive storms that nobody ever thought they would see. When I do my preparedness message, I know that there's probably somebody in the audience that, I lived through Betsy. These storms are different. And even at the last tornado storms that we saw in Texas, those steel pipe power lines were bent like this. And so we're looking at damage to critical infrastructure so much more significantly. I look at this from a perspective that they have to go ahead of time. And so practical things for them to do is to make those decisions. They have to heed the forecast. They need to find a reliable source. I know everybody's got Facebook, whatever they want to do, but finding that source that you can rely on, listening to public officials, provide that. The other thing is we do have residents and citizens that are living in substandard housing, whether that's mobile homes, travel trailers. Those are not the appropriate places to do that. So they need to really seek shelter ahead of time. I know, Collin, they do all kind of alerts at the local level too. So we are meeting not just at the local partnership level, but also at the state level. So when that messaging comes, we definitely provide that support so they can make the best decisions for their family. Collin?
Yeah. If we're able to make the call of either voluntary or mandatory evacuation, we will do it. And that's the time to go. Like from the, start a stopwatch as soon as the word comes out from the mayor, from the governor, it's time to go. Unfortunately, when we're talking about rapid intensification and things like that, those decisions probably are going to be very difficult to make under the circumstances because of the amount of time that you have to have in advance to do things like contraflow and to make steps like city-assisted evacuation and things like that. So, I hate to say it is rather, specific to whatever the situation the person is in or their family is in. If they have people that have, medical special needs, dialysis, things like that, leave as early as possible. When you start seeing a lot of these things, when you see Chris doing a forecast that is, hey, listen, pay attention, this is something, that's the time to really have the car ready. If you're going to leave, if you're going to hunker down, just be prepared that afterwards you may have to get out quickly, or, it may be rather uncomfortable here for a week or so, or 2 weeks after the storm. But I think that our local media here is very good at leveling with the folks and leveling with the community about kind of where we're at. And then we're taking a lot of cues from the Weather Service, from our local partners here with media about, what's this timeline going to look like, and what can we put together out of our toolbox to try and make sure that particularly the most vulnerable are going to be, are going to be at least on an even footing with everyone else.
Yeah. I think one thing, too, that people forget about, and the further away we get from Katrina, I guess, people, are really forgetting. But so we do have a new levee system in New Orleans. We're much better protected than we were during Katrina. But this system isn't it's as the experts say, it's probably going to be overtopped one day. Collin, what do you tell people? I guess there's probably some residents who say, I don't have to go anywhere. We have the levees now. Do you all try to advise people on the condition of the levees, or what the state of that is?
Look,
now?
we work very closely with the Corps of Engineers, and now really more of the local levee districts and the flood protection authorities east and west. I think it was tested during Ida, particularly on the West Bank, but it wasn't tested on the East Bank, and I think that's pretty clear. We've had some years of low river lately, so that's another consideration. So what I always try and say is, to your point, it's the best levee protection we have had, and it is exponentially better than 2005, which is what caused these issues with Hurricane Katrina. I have a lot of faith in this system, but it's a system. It's built by humans. It's not infallible. I think that we have to be ready in case that happens. I'm a little bit less worried about the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system, the levee system, as far as the catastrophic type flooding that you saw 20 years ago. A little less concerned about that, and I'm actually more concerned about infrastructure issues like drainage, infrastructure issues like power, and having to try and navigate and live here post-storm immediately and getting people back. That's my main concern. But I think that the system itself is amazing. I mean, you look at the surge barrier and some of these other protective measures that they've been able to build. I think we're definitely in better shape. I just think that everyone always has to be ready for the worst case scenario.
Yeah, the most expensive project of its kind in the history of the Corps of
Correct.
Engineers.
Biggest design build project ever. Although I think they're working on something somewhere else right now that might be bigger. But that Lake-Borgne surge barrier at one time was the largest project the Corps of Engineers ever built.
Yeah. But the conditions are also changing rapidly. It's built for 100-year storm surge, so we have to be prepared for that. And we also have to be prepared for I guess, there's a lot of rainfall events that are happening with these storms that we maybe don't think of as much, I guess, Chris. Is that, we saw in Harvey, for example.
Right. Well, the impacts per storm are completely different. Some are more wind events, some are more surge, some are more rainfall, some are a combination thereof. But what's also interesting, what you just saw in South Florida, they've had several inches of rain, and this was an unnamed just rainmaker. We can easily get these big summertime rain events, tropical or non-tropical, that can dump a deluge of rain. As a matter of fact, we kind of joke I don't remember exactly. It might have been Barry that we were waiting for. We knew it was going to impact us on a Wednesday. So the focus was on Wednesday, and 2 days before we get this
that
deluge. Barry. I don't remember. It was Barry? And it was, and it was like, where did this come from?
Right.
And I went,
it's not even the storm yet.
This is even, and Barry did absolutely nothing to us, but it was a summer thunderstorm. We got into that track where it kept training and just kept building, and we can see what happens with those types. And Rubby had mentioned with tornadoes. I mean, we have kind of a year-round, risk. We're obviously focusing more on hurricanes, but just some of those tropical downpours that we can get that are unannounced in the summertime can do sometimes just as much or more of an impact to our area. So sometimes just because it doesn't have a name doesn't mean it can't bring with it some destruction.
Yeah, we got an interesting question from one of the readers asking, this is kind of a very complicated question, maybe you can address it generally. obviously land loss, coastal erosion is a big issue here, and he's asking how has that changed our risk in terms of storms? I guess because we have much less buffer now for
Right.
hurricanes.
That's what it is. It's the key is that's our buffer. That is the coastal plain is our safeguard from that surge. That low-lying marsh between the city proper and down to our coastal communities and the open Gulf is that marshland that is supposed to absorb the surge. Our barrier islands, that is, by definition, they are our barrier between these surges coming in, and those should, in essence, kind of dampen down the impacts. And as we lose more and more of that protection, it just puts us more and more at risk.
Yeah.
And
Rubby, go ahead,
I was going
Collin.
to say
Yeah.
every storm is different too. It's you get something like an Isaac that dumps rain on you for 3-4 days.
Yeah.
And so then you're wondering, that's a slower moving tropical storm Cat 1 type scenario, and then you get something like Hurricane Zeta that moved through at almost 50 miles an hour and was gone within 3 hours, and that
That
caused
night we're all-
damage. Caused damage, wind damage, turned our power grid into sticks, like it does. But I don't even remember if there was appreciable rainfall in Zeta.
There was not.
Yeah.
We had a Cat 3 move directly over the city.
Right.
I mean, the eye, that's what amazed people. No one had been through the eye like
Right.
that. And it's amazing. The winds just died. And I said, get back inside.
Right.
It's about to get bad again from the other direction. I said, but it's incredible to see. But again, every storm is different. That was booking it.
Right.
We went on, we were, doing wall-to-wall coverage. And by about 10:30, it was, all right, we can go home.
Right.
I mean, no power, and what was different about Zeta was being so late in the season, it was followed behind a cold front, so it wasn't as uncomfortable as it would have
Correct.
been during an August storm. You
Right.
open up your windows, and it was actually manageable during
Right.
the aftermath and cleanup.
Yeah, yeah. But I guess in terms of the coastal issues, Rubby, that's an issue here, obviously. But other parts, some of the coastal areas of the state, they really have to get out when some of these storms are coming. I guess they have, especially if you're below the levee system and you're kind of you're especially vulnerable. I mean, how does the state advise these communities?
Well, we look at that from again. It goes back to local control and hearing those warnings, whether it's a voluntary or mandatory evacuation. We like even from Cameron Parish, which is right there. They've been through it before. And here's the thing: we know that storm surge is probably a number one death of people. The impact of a storm, and so you can't swim out there. Those folks they don't really realize that could be a drowning issue for them. So we definitely try to heed the warning. It goes back to, do you have your plan in place? Execute your plan when you get the information to do that, and listen to your local officials. We definitely try to make sure that, and I do know that when you're looking at evacuation, if you're doing self-evacuations, is making sure you plan for alternate routes. We have gone accustomed to Waze and Google Maps, but even learning other alternate routes, because if you have other communities or other parishes evacuate too, you want to be able to kind of get ahead of that. So I go try to keep your family comfortable, safe, connected. Those are things we can't control. Weather changes at a blink of an eye. And I know you're emailing them, Chris. I really do. But I just, here's the thing: we can't ever determine, is it just going to be a wind event? Is it going to be a rain event? Is it going to be major flooding for that? So it's important for them emergency managers have a difficult job. They have to listen to all decisions, data, information, but they're looking at all that information to they tell their local officials so they can make the better decision for the citizenry. But the other thing is, I think that is ownership to the families too. You're trying to make the best decision for your family, and I want you to think about that. Think about the number of households that might be the single mom with 3 kids. Can you imagine evacuating 3 kids under the age of 5? That mama has a lot on her plate. And so it's important to make sure that you have the partnerships and support to make sure you get out of harm's way. Our number one issue is to protect life and property, and that's what we're going to do. The other thing is ownership happens at the individual level too, and so making sure you know your plan, you've already planned for it. We talk about power going out, and Collin's got a great idea, making sure your tank is full during this time of year, but also making sure you have some emergency cash, because those ATM machines will not work. So making sure you have alternate sources to have some redundancy so you can get out of harm's way.
And this, obviously insurance is on a lot of people's minds in the state right now. A lot of that discussion is beyond our scope today. But maybe if you all have any advice for, often people come back, they find damage, they have to make claims, they end up fighting with their insurance company. Can you all advise people on what to do? Should they take pictures before and after? Should they make sure they have certain documents with them to make sure they can make an effective claim with their insurance companies after?
Absolutely. I tell them to go ahead and document it beforehand. That way you can have a timestamp of this is when this picture was taken. Do a complete inventory of your house. The other thing is make sure that you know more about Jake that State Farm wears khakis, then he wears khakis. It's important for you to look at your policy, your settlement papers. I go back to the flood of 2016. There's a lot of people that had flood insurance but didn't have contents because they didn't think. Think about the myths. Really get to your local emergency manager always has data on. The reason why they collect data on damages is because they want to be able to be proactive and mitigate those risks. And so I think we own it to ourselves is to make sure that we look at policies ahead of time. And with flood insurance, it's supposed to help protect you. I know that they came out with Flood Risk 2.0, and they came out on not Valentine's Day, but April the 1st, which is bizarre. But it's important for us to know our limits. It's also important if you have insurance issues, contact the Department of Insurance. They have a community advocacy group right there that really fights for those consumers. And I think it's important to understand that lingo. I think we take, for instance, that we got insurance, but we never really read the policy. And like most people have a misperception, if you have insurance, I can't apply for FEMA. You can apply for FEMA. FEMA just can't pay what some other source is paying for you. So really, if you have to recover and you want to maximize your recovery, you got to maintain documentations, copy of policies. I tell people to scan it, either send it to yourself on a Google Drive so if you could access it somewhere else. It's important for you to keep small things like even a paper or invoice from your electric company, because you have to prove ownership and occupancy when you apply for FEMA. And FEMA has done some significant reforms for their individual assistance program because of the fact that I think because Louisiana has had multiple back-to-back storms and we've had so many struggles with folks being able to get even play field for recovery. So it's important for us to make sure that you have your packet together. And that way, when you're filing for that claim, keep a journal. Who you talked to, when you talked to, what was their phone number, their email, what you provided. Because it becomes if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. And so those are the things I would tell. And if you don't know your policy that well, call Jake from State Farms and say, please explain this to me. Because there were a lot of folks in Ida, believe it or not, that had loss of use. They could have, that insurance company could pay for a hotel room for them, and they didn't know they could access it.
Yeah, there's a hurricane deductible. I think a lot of people don't realize that's in addition to your regular deductible, right? So
Right.
yeah, you have to be aware of that.
I would agree with everything. I would just say that there's no such thing as too little information. To have everything, every season, take a good assessment of what you have, where it's at, do an insurance checkup with your insurance agent, and just say, look, is there anything we should be doing? Because they know, and they're locals. They're doing the same thing. They're going to recommend, look, you may need to come up a little on this, or, I doubt they're ever going to say you don't need this, but, they're at least going to get you, because we find underinsurance a lot, which can be addressed through federal programs, but, you'll have to go through the process. And what I will say is the state has set up damage.la.gov. I think it's it's a great website. Enter in your damage into that website, because what we do as locals, we do it as well. That goes directly to the people at FEMA who need to see what we're looking like on the ground and how much assistance is going to be needed to come down here. It's not the only thing they look at, but it's something, I think, a very accurate snapshot, especially in the first couple of days after a storm. If you're putting in you're taking a picture of your roof damage, submitting it. It's takes 2 seconds on this website, damage.la.gov. We're all using it as locals as well, and I think it's becoming a great repository for information about each individual event. And so, but I would say for New Orleans, get flood insurance. We just chronically have a low percentage of homeowners that have flood insurance. And I'm talking about, look, it may be required for a mortgage, but we have a lot of homes that have been passed down through generations. They don't have mortgages, and they're underinsured or they're not insured. And so, you know, I know it's a burden, but it will make your life so much easier just talking about from the perspective of getting back into your home, you know, is to get insurance.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, as we wrap up, maybe everybody can reflect a little bit on some of the kind of main point as we look ahead. You know, we have that couple months, sort of, as Collin mentioned, although it's never too early. So Chris, maybe you can just some final thoughts on as we approach this potentially busy season.
You know, listening to our emergency officials, we try and give specific advice to individuals as well as kind of a blanket decision, but you really can't make those blanket decisions. And folks will ask us in the media, well, what should I do for X storm? And I said, I can't tell you what you should do. What I will tell you is what I'm doing for my family. And at that point, at one moment with Ida, I said, you know, I don't know how bad it's going to be. As of right now, I have 2 young kids. My wife is planning to stay at home. And then the next day, as I saw a new computer model, I went on the air and said, I am advising my wife and family and my kids and my family to leave. Well, you said you were. And I said, well, things change. So I will be open and honest about what I'm doing for myself. I cannot tell you specifically what you should or can do because everyone is different. So we usually kind of give that advice of, you know, do you feel comfortable where you are? If you're in an evacuation zone that you've been ordered to leave, you have to leave. But if you're in an area where you feel comfortable, you feel safe, we're going back to, you know, personal responsibility. And then also, we as we've kind of experienced from past storms, are you okay if you don't have a generator with sitting in 95-degree weather, high humidity, heat index of Lord knows what in your home for sometimes weeks on end? If you're okay with that, then by all means stay. But otherwise, you have to treat each storm individually. And that's why just that one forecast cone graphic doesn't tell you the whole picture. That's why we're going to go into great detail, sometimes more detail than my producers would like me to go into, because I'd like to spend a lot more time explaining it. But the thing is, each storm is completely different. The impacts, where it's making landfall, where those impacts could be greatest. Sometimes we have a pretty good idea of where those impacts will be worse, and sometimes we don't. And sometimes we have to give kind of that blanket statement of this entire area of the coast could see X number of feet of surge, and we try and break it down even parish by parish to give those folks the most detailed information we can. But, you know, as Collin said, it does sound cliche. It only takes one, and each storm, each season is completely different. So just because you went through major Hurricane Ida unscathed, you got your power back fairly quickly, damage was minimal or even non-existent, that does not mean a storm making landfall in almost the exact same place is going to have the exact same impacts.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's some great points. Ruby, do you want to address some of that?
I would agree with Chris on that. I guess for me, though, it's more of lessons learned because the way I look at it is, you know, we can't predict that power grid's going to come back in 72 hours. And so I really do worry about the folks that says almost hook her down and then services are not there, power's not there. It's really a danger area. Communication is down. And so that causes more stress for a family. I think about significant trauma that does for not only family, but even first responders that are trying to get restoration back in their community. So to me, I always say go before contraflow because of the fact that you want to be comfortable. I like power. I mean, that's why I work in emergency management, because I got to do shelter duty and I had a generator there. But, you know, here's the thing. We do have folks that are vulnerable. You know, do you have 3 weeks of medication? Because your pharmacy may not be open when you hunker down. So I would just say, do you have the resources to maintain? And we also know, based on Hurricane Laura, Delta, and also Zeta, all the Mardi Gras crew that came in, and plus Ida, we know that those communities were crippled for a very long time. It took them at least 6 to 8 weeks to actually get restoration. And so when I look at that, I said, you know, that's not a safe place to be. Sometimes there's folks that may have to relocate because the housing stock is so crippled. And so that's how you prepare. If you couldn't return back to your residence based on catastrophic damage, do you have what you need? Can you be connected to services? So I go back from lessons learned most recently in the 5 years that I've been at GOHSEP, and I've worked in emergency management for over 30. It's important for people to understand what we're currently seeing. And who would ever thought that we had hurricanes and we also worked wildfires last summer?
Yes.
Nobody ever thought Louisiana. So we are definitely experiencing a lot of extreme weather issues. And so to me, it's like, what's best for my family? What's best for me and my family? Emergency managers make decisions based on data and information. We're looking at forecasts, and I'll just tell you, forecast and tools that meteorology has now is significant that drives our stuff. But we're also looking at things that could be vulnerabilities to our critical infrastructure. So when an emergency manager is meeting with state level advisors, meteorologists, and also with their leadership, they're going to make the best decisions to keep people safe.
Yeah, it feels like the bingo card keeps expanding with wildfires and everything else. But yeah,
Exactly.
Anyway, so yeah, Collin, if you want to give some final thoughts.
Three
on
things, make a plan, have that plan, where you're going, who you're going to, who to contact, including obviously children, pets, and your any elderly or medically vulnerable. Please, if you have a seat in your car, get them in there if you're going to leave. So make that plan. Gather supplies, whether it's going to be for staying at home, riding something out, smaller level, or you're, like you said, you feel comfortable where you're at, that you can make it through. Understanding the risks afterwards, possibly with, power loss and even the potential for some street flooding and outright flooding, or having those supplies you need, to leave town. And so again, 3 days worth, 72 hours is ideal. We want to try and get to you sooner, but you always have to be prepared. And then the third is just staying connected. In New Orleans, or for anyone really, you can go to ready.nola.gov. We have a lot of hurricane preparedness tips and advice, and you can sign up for alerts there. We do have a pretty substantial, through NOLA Ready, we have an alert system that we are sending out constantly alerts, rebroadcasting National Weather Service alerts, and just keeping the people informed. And you can either sign up at ready.nola.gov, or you can text NOLA Ready, one word, to 77295. And I think staying connected is the key, because when you ask the question, when should I do this, when should I do that, when you start seeing some of these messages coming through, it's going to be pretty apparent that this is going to be affecting us, and it's time to go, or it's time to hunker down and just be ready.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, some real solid advice as we head into this season. We thank the panelists for coming today. 3 really solid experts to you should maybe heed their advice. So we want to also thank AARP, our sponsor, and please check back to the Times-Picayune, NOLA.com, the Advocate.com for reporting throughout this season. And if, knock on wood, hopefully we won't have the risk of a storm, but if we do, of course, we'll be reporting on that. Thank you very much.